Chapter 3, for example, explore different note-taking strategies, and purple for the main heading, like the chapter topic, and then pink for like the main ideas. Hi everyone, I'm Eve. I'm currently a freshman at Peking University on the finance track, and today I wanted to make this video to show you guys how I take notes, as that's been requested in a couple of videos. Now, in the past, I do want to preface that I was definitely like a notebook, pen, paper kind of girly, but as I moved on in high school, I realized that it can actually be a very big hassle to keep up with the lecture while the teacher was talking because of how fast-paced the class would be at times. And I just found later on, especially during my junior year and senior year of high school, that typing things out was a lot faster in terms of like being able to keep up with what the teacher was saying. But I have now transitioned out of that typing phase, and I'm now in more of like an iPad kind of phase. I will say I do a mix of typing and writing out my notes all on my iPad, and I think it's just been really helpful to have everything compiled into one like device, I guess, so that I don't have like a bunch of loose papers everywhere or a bunch of notebooks that I have to carry around. And I previously had done my notes on like Google Docs and stuff through Google Docs, and I felt like that was pretty helpful too, but I think it's been nice to have this iPad because that way I can simultaneously type when I need to if the lecture is a little faster, and I can also choose to grab my pen and my iPad and start writing things out. So that's essentially the kind of strategy that I'm using right now, and I'm going to dive into the specifics of how I've been using my iPad, and I'm going to show you guys some of my actual notes from this semester. So I have the iPad Pro. It's the 13-inch. I got it last summer, so it's a relatively new model, I would say, but I know that I think they're coming out with new ones. And so I pair this iPad with this black case. It's very simple, very sleek. We have this keyboard here, and then the pen that I'm using is not actually the Apple pen because the Apple pen was a little bit out of my budget, especially after I'd already gotten such an expensive iPad. So I do have a pen that works on my iPad. It's not the Apple pen, but I can also leave the links down below of my products if you guys are interested in checking it out. If you watched my Why 2025 Will Be Your Best Year Yet, you will know that this pen, or you've seen how I write with this pen, and it doesn't like have any lag necessarily, and so it's pretty smooth, I would say. Like just writing it out, there are no gaps or anything, so that's, I know, a major concern for a lot of people when they're buying like not the actual Apple product in terms of like the pen, whether they're going to be like cut off in gaps, but this iPad and this pen doesn't seem to have an issue with that. So now onto the juicy nitty-gritty of what you're probably watching this video for, my notes. So the note-taking app that I use is Free Notes. We have Free Notes here, and then I have a bunch of different folders. It's not the most organized thing in the world, but I think it has worked for me so far. And so what you see right now is the Chinese folder that I created actually a couple of days ago because I've come back for break and I'm trying to pick up a little bit on my Chinese because I feel like while I've been in school, it's been so much like math that I haven't actually been able to really take the time to improve my Chinese. But anyways, so we have these different folders, and so for example, my economics folder has a bunch of different notes, and so what I do is I go to the website where the professors upload the slides and stuff, and I will typically download the slides, and that way I have it for reference if, for example, the professor goes a little faster and I don't get a chance to actually write down or type out what I want to say. I can always just go back or have a split screen where I have like this slide at view, and then I can also open Free Notes again, and then, oh, that's my Chinese vocab, but I can do that, and then also have econ, for example. So I can have econ, and then I can also have my notes over here, and so I also have different layers for my notes, so I guess let's switch this around. And so yeah, when I'm taking notes, it typically looks something like this, so that if the professor is going faster, then I'll be able to look at the notes and then go back as I need to as the professor is talking. And then previously I had at first started by writing on the slides. Like if you look at, for example, back when I was doing chemistry, I also downloaded the slides as such. So if we open up to chapter 3, for example, then you can see here that at first I was writing on the slides because I felt like that was an easier way to keep up with lecture, but then later on I did end up creating a chapter notes in class where I would actually write out the stuff that was on the slides and summarize it in my own words and the key concepts and such like that. And I felt that that kind of helped me more actively engage in the lecture. But that was for chemistry. And then the economics, I started writing, like I had my own notes file for the classes. And so how I did it was for each lecture I would create, or for each chapter I would create a layer in my notes, and that's something that free notes allows you to do. You can add a layer and then you can turn on the layer or close the layer. And so right now we have chapter 21, but if I wanted to go back to chapter 11 and 13, I could just go through that. And then so obviously, for example, now we're here, but then if I opened up another layer, then it might overlap a little bit like that. So that's why typically how I organized it was that I wanted each layer to start from page 1. That way I could just kind of like, it would each have its own entity, rather than, like, for example, if I did it where the layers were open and I started from chapter 1, then chapter 10 would probably start at like page 15 or even more than that, and so then I would have to scroll every time. And so this way, because the layers are overlapping, it's easier for me to access each chapter that I'm looking for specifically just by looking at this layout, and I think that's been really helpful for me. And then so for econ, I primarily took my notes through typing because it just seemed easier that way. And you might be wondering why my notes are in English, because if you remember, I mentioned before, I go to Peking University, and so all my classes are in Chinese, but I have found that it's been easier for me to first write things out in English or learn things out, like the basic concepts in English, and then kind of like translate it into Chinese after I've gotten a grasp of that concept. That way that I know that I have a good standing of the material that I'm learning before I go and challenge myself and learn it in a different language. But obviously the slides are primarily in Mandarin, and so that's been kind of like a difficult time in trying to like process and find out what actually works for me. But if you're watching this, you probably are learning in your first language, so that's not going to be as much of an issue. But I did start to develop, I think, second half of the semester, like a better coding method that I used, where I have like purple for the main heading, like the chapter topic, and then pink for like the main ideas, and then blue is kind of like the subtopics below those main ideas. And I think that this has really helped me kind of just have, because I'm more of a visual learner a lot of the times, and I think it's really nice to have those visual colors for me to look back at, and then also yellows for anything that's like very important concepts. And I think this way has just really helped in allowing me to process the information. And then I also did screenshot any important graphs that I didn't really feel like drawing out, because I feel like also a lot of the times the graphs that are on the PowerPoints are typically more straightforward and easier to just see rather than a visual graph yourself. But obviously when I was studying, I did go back and draw the graphs myself. Like for example, for the MC, ATC, ABC curves, that was something that I obviously needed to know how to draw for the economics course that I was taking. And then I also did end up going back, like when I was studying for the exams, I went back and took some notes on the sides for some of the concepts that I was learning about. But like I went back and did some red notes, and kind of on the side I would answer the questions that I actually put. And so that's another thing. I think I've adopted more of like a Cornell notes kind of like note-taking strategy is what I've been using so far, and it's been helping me, I would say. And so what it basically entails is on the side while you're taking notes, you have like a small column for the questions that you can write out and create for yourself while you're taking the notes. And that I think really helps in terms of keeping up with what you're actually doing. And so let me see if I can find a good example of, because like sometimes the lecture's going so fast, so I didn't actually end up writing the questions. But when I did remember to write the questions, I would say that it was definitely a very helpful strategy that I used. So for example, here we have 收入与歧视, which is basically like income and discrimination. And so for economics, like price discrimination and such. And so again, we have the purple heading, and then any like key concepts that we have here, which are in pink, and then on the left of them I wrote out questions for myself to look back on as the lecture was going on, because sometimes I feel like professors do tend to run on tangents, and I think it's helpful that if what they're saying isn't something that you need to be actively engaged in, you can also use that time to create these questions for yourself. For example, like, what are factors that determine equilibrium wage? And I actually do have the answers in my notes, but I think like later on when I do go and study for this material, then I can just go ahead and answer these questions. And if I know these answers to these questions, then that kind of gives me an idea of what kind of grasp I have over the notes in the material. And that's kind of what I did for another chapter. Like for chapter 17, I actually went back and answered these questions in red. I was writing it out because I felt like that was a better way to reinforce what I was doing. And so I think that it's really helpful sometimes to just have those questions. That way you don't actually have to go and make your questions, because then you're doubling your studying time essentially. So I think that during lecture, if you can go ahead and make those questions as you're taking the notes, you're not only saving yourself time later on, you're also kind of reinforcing that material and actively forcing yourself to process that information and create questions based on the material that you're learning, so that you're not just mindlessly writing things down or typing things out. Math was, I would say, a very interesting subject and a very different way. I think for each subject I kind of took notes differently, but before we go into math, I want to kind of show you how I did bio, because bio was kind of similar to econ, so I think we should just group that together. And so bio, I also downloaded the slides, and so you might be wondering why, like, for this first semester there are only so many slides, but the slides sometimes were extremely long. Like this one was only 36 pages, but for example this one was 48, and then I believe there was one that was like 109 pages. And so there's just a lot of stuff that we went over in one semester. And so again, with bio, kind of like for chemistry, so I started off by writing on the slides like with the definitions and stuff of the Chinese words, or the Mandarin words, because obviously I feel like I have a pretty strong base in biology, but I took it in English, so you can imagine how much of a struggle it was to kind of translate all of the key vocab terms and words that I needed to know. And so that's essentially like the notes that I was taking. I was just basically translating the Chinese words into English. And then I will say that a lot of the slides were actually in English. I'm not sure if it's because of the resource that my professor was using to take the notes, but that was something that was helpful too, because there were certain parts that I didn't even need to translate because they were already in English, which I was very grateful for. But then later on, I did also end up creating like a document with the different layers. This was the second half of the semester, so not all of my notes are like this, but like for example, if we look at topic 2 for genes, at first I didn't use the Cornell note structure, but I just kind of had like the topic that I needed to know, and like I started screenshotting the parts that I needed. And then this is where you can see I started transitioning into the Cornell method, which I think was very helpful. And as you can see, I did end up answering the question in very messy handwriting later on, but I just have like the main topic and the subtopics and the notes here with the questions that I can look back on. And again, I really do actually recommend this note-taking method because it's honestly helped me a lot, and I found it to be very useful when I went back to study, and having those questions to just look back on, because you know that they directly apply to the notes and the lecture that you were taking in before, versus like I feel like some of the online questions that you might find might not be like specifically what your professor might want you to know. And so, but if you create the questions yourself, you know that that's going to be most likely the material or similar to the material that's going to be on your test. And then so that was for bio. And then I guess the final thing that I'm going to touch on really quickly is my calculus notes. Here we have independent notes that I took for math, and these are just kind of like, I don't even know how to explain my math notes because it's just kind of all over the place. But essentially how it was again, I had and so again I created the different layers for my different subjects and different chapters. Here we can have starting from a couple of chapters here. And so essentially what it entailed was I would have chapter 6, where I would take notes from the textbook and kind of process it myself and write down any key, like dingli, or dingli means principles, and then that I would need to remember and such. And I would have the heading here, and that way it was easily accessible. And then for any examples that were in the actual textbook, I would often, if I had time, I would work them out. And so for example, you can see here I have these examples that I wrote down the example and then I tried to work it out myself, and then I had like the step-by-step process in the textbook, so then it was an easier way to actively learn rather than just mindlessly taking notes on the textbook. But I think that was very helpful overall. Because it is math, I didn't really prioritize like keeping things looking super clean and neat. I feel like my main thing was just making sure I did as many problems as I could at an efficient pace. And then I also, for the lecture notes that I took in class, this is, for example, and this is a lot more organized because I was literally just writing down everything that my professor said, because I feel like for math, like that's just kind of what you do because you don't want to miss any step, because later on when you're going back to review the lecture notes, you want to make sure that you have every single step down, because otherwise I feel like it can be quite the hassle to like try to figure out what your professor was trying to say. And then I would also like kind of like write in big pink like why, like if I was ever confused on whatever the professor was saying during lecture. That's essentially how I've been taking notes with my iPad, and I'm definitely still in a work in progress and trying to refine the strategy and the method that I've been using to learn. And I think that I am just in my freshman year, so I'm definitely going to keep evolving the way that I'm learning, but this strategy and the things that I've been doing now have been fairly helpful overall, I would say. And so I do want to address some of you who might be wondering if you are considering investing in an iPad. I would say it really depends on your own situation and how you already take notes. If you're someone that likes to write on pen and paper and just you feel like you might not like the feeling of writing on an iPad, I would say that you should try that out first and see if you can actually get used to that. But if you do like take notes on Google Docs and typing, I feel like if that's something that if you don't want to write your notes out and you feel like that's not necessary, then I feel like you can do what you do on an iPad with Google Docs as well. But I think the iPad and the note-taking interface does help to have things organized and set out in different folders, which I definitely really appreciate. But it is quite a big like monetary investment, I would say, because an iPad is not cheap and the pencil is not cheap as well. But I do think it has really helped me kind of become more organized and explore different note-taking strategies. And I personally really like my iPad because I don't like carrying around a bunch of notebooks and scattered papers, and I do like being able to type things out, but I also like being able to transition into writing when it feels necessary, and just having everything digital on an iPad has really helped. But obviously I feel like any kind of tablet really can do the same thing. So if this is something you're interested in, like you don't necessarily have to stick with an iPad if you're not an Apple user. Android tablets can also be really helpful, but obviously I haven't really tried it out, so I wouldn't be the best judge of whether or not they're up to par with the iPad standard. But I'm actually an Android user myself. Like my computer and my phone is Android, and so it's been interesting to kind of like experiment with Apple as well. And so I think that it really depends up to you and your situation. But I've personally found the iPad and my note-taking regime to be quite useful. And I am thinking about starting to use the digital planner that's also on Free Notes, and potentially exploring GoodNotes as well, because I've heard great things about it. But that's essentially how I take notes, and I am again going to adapt. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, and if you'd like to follow me on my journey as a international student at Peking University, please consider subscribing, and I will see you guys in the next one.